Yes, so only a handful more. They can do that to you this summer. Worcester, can you hear me A-okay? We can't hear you.
Hey, that's fine.
Worcester, can we hear you at all? Test, test, 1, 2.
Yeah, can you hear us?
Yeah, there we go. And, okay, you came back. All right. And little technical difficulties here in Manchester. Hopefully this projector lamp will hold on. We're kind of on the edge of a lamp bursting.
Why, what's happening up there with the projector?
What's that?
What's happening with the projector?
Oh, one of them has just decided to sleep for a little bit. Alan's got it up going, but apparently it's been flickering on the edge of extinction for each lecture over the past few days.
Okay.
But it's good to go. All right. Everybody all good to go down there, Worcester? As good as it gets? All right. Don't even wait for an answer. I just keep plowing through, huh? All right. As promised, we got to zip through the end of Module 2. And essentially, the end of Module 2, we were just talking about feedback mechanisms. We're talking about a kidney. We're talking about a filtering system. And the major piece of that filtering is how much blood you're pushing through the filter. And we talked about the filter on a local level. In other words, the kidney by itself locally is always trying to maintain a nice GFR within its, within the end zones, if you will. So that's via a little bit of stretch from the arterial going in and out. So you got a direct feedback that way. And then the nephron itself has its way of saying, hey, what's going on with the flow? And that's really through the sodium monitoring. Too much sodium going through that nephron gives that little feedback to say, ooh, there's an increase, so let's bring it down, and vice versa. So that's the local, just kind of keep that GFR, as we said, within the means, while the body, meanwhile, on the outside is kind of going through the ups and downs of living life. Then on the neuroreg that we had talked about really was just describing the role of the sympathetic nervous system on the kidney. And we just briefly made the comment, sympathetics in general, their job is not so much what's going on with kidney, but to use the kidney to make sure systemically you get enough BP and fluid volume going through. So anything involving sympathetics is going to be limiting to GFR, so involving constriction, and it makes sense, blood vessel constriction, shunting blood away from the viscera to do so. So that was where we left our story off, and then we, I think, paused right here to pick things up. So as we get to hormonal regulation, essentially really what we're just talking about now is the body as a whole, how it's regulating its fluid and pressure, equilibrium, and what it tells the kidney to do and not to do, some of the signaling that goes on for that. So the big player, obviously, and we've talked about it, I know we've had it kind of pop its head multiple times at different points, but the renin-angio-aldosterone system, or RAS, is the major system to say, let's increase BP, let's maintain and retain blood volume. The natriuretic peptides are the antagonists to that RAS system. So we'll chat a little bit about, I'd kind of circled the renin as far as, who's telling that to be released or not to release. It's really the signaling mechanism for it. So again, we've had this multiple times. Just make sure you're up to speed with a little hierarchy of the system itself before we get into the nuances of who's telling renin to either be secreted or not secreted. But in relation to our kidney discussion, those juxtaglomerular cells right there near the glomerulus and, the DCT sneaking by there, those guys are, that's where we synthesize and release renin. So once renin pops out, pre-angio converts it to angio 1. Angio 1 still needs to be converted, so Your ACE produced in your lungs, that's the next step in that cascade to get an active form of angio, which is angiotensin II. Angio 2, which we talked about with our endocrine discussion with the adrenal cortex, is that signaling mechanism to release aldosterone. So that's kind of the hierarchy. The only thing we're going to expand on a little bit is a little more specifically here with the angio 2 and some of its actions on the kidney and the players in all this. So we'll sneak forwards and look at, well, I guess I'll back up a little bit. We'll look at the big picture of this outside of that hierarchy, and then we'll look at angio 2 a little more specifically. So these next couple of slides, this outlines pretty nice little synopsis of that pressure and fluid equilibrium for the renin system. And really what it identifies are the three signaling keys that are saying, hey, let's release renin. The systemic global one is the obvious reduce blood volume itself. That goes down, pressure goes down, obviously, and those hand in hand are kicking in some mechanisms to ratchet this up. The first one on the list, sympathetics. Sympathetics we already chatted about. What's it do? It's going to decrease GFR, but in an effort to say let's not excrete fluid out of the body, but it's also going to be one of the stimulus too as well for renin release, which is going to further encourage retaining fluid in the body. The decreased pressure, same thing as a signaling mechanism, as well as that decreased flow. In other words, if you've got reduced volume, you just naturally already have reduced flow going through the kidney. You already have a drop in GFR, which means those sodium receptors of the kidney are telling the system they're going to signal to release renin. So that's not the direct little local mechanism we talked about before. This big mechanism is overriding those local controls, if you will. So that's where sometimes you start saying, doesn't that sodium signaling, it sounds contradictory. So these are the big three as far as stimulus for to occur. If you think about it, with the sympathetics, besides stimulating the renin, its major, big picture is to constrict, blood vessels throughout. And again, obviously, that renal blood supply is no different, so it's constricting those arterioles, trying to shut that down. But in the big picture of things, trying to get systemic BP up. Renin, its scenario is to eventually trigger that little cascade we talked about to get angio 2 out in the system. So angio 2 is going to float around and have its effect throughout the body, brainstem and other places, as well as that releasing of aldosterone from the cortex that we had chatted about, which both of those together are going to be a stimulus to retain fluid and, retain sodium and fluid out of those kidneys. So let's look at angio 2. As I said, that's kind of the piece in all this. We've talked about it, and it's got multiple effects. We'll talk about aldosterone a little bit in Module 2 as far as its direct action at the very end of the nephron, telling that late DCT to pull back more sodium, essentially. But we'll get to that in a moment. So angio 2, as it's released, it too is a vasoconstrictor, so it's got a little bit kind of synergistic with those sympathetics, so everybody's doing the same thing, makes sense. Upstairs brainstem telling you to drink, intake fluid, makes sense. And again, even more synergistic towards adrenal release too as well. So they're all going in the same direction. Again, it's very synergistic to the sympathetics in this scenario. Regarding aldosterone and ADH, it's got a release for both. So again, directly that adrenal cortex is releasing the aldosterone. And the aldosterone piece is that sodium piece. In other words, it's going to make that nephron pull back more sodium. But hand in hand, it's not really the sodium you're chasing, it's water follows sodium. So you want to make that nephron more permeable to water at the same time so more water can go back into the bloodstream. So you need the ADH as well. So again, aldosterone or angio2, very pro stimulating effect as far as that posterior pituitary that we had chatted about way back when and an endocrine lecture. So these two hand in hand, aldosterone, ADH, acting on that distal tubule, the distal convoluted tubule and beginning in the collecting duct, they change the wall to pull in more sodium and pull in more water at the same time. A couple other more local actions, these guys we haven't chatted about with the NGO system, and they just simply make sense, and they're a little bit not smaller, but again, encouraging reducing that GFR and encouraging fluid flow. Angio2, we talked about this peritubular system. It's a second capillary mechanism. If you think about it, this is where reabsorption is taking place. And if you've got high pressure going through there, you're pushing fluid through there a lot quicker and not allowing time to reabsorb. And the pressure gradient isn't in your favor for reabsorption. So another little subtle action of angio is to reduce that pressure in that capillary system to favor fluid going from the kidney into the blood vessel. Again, all trying to do the same thing. And then last but not least, contraction of the mesangial cells. We've mentioned that earlier. These guys, so smooth muscle, they got a little phagocytic role, but smooth muscle. And as they contract or relax, they either reduce the surface area, if you will, of the glomerular capillaries or increase it. And the contraction reduces it, and so that ultimately cuts down on your filtration too. So again, you look at angio and pretty complex, but everything working synergistically and everything it's doing in that ultimate role, elevate BP, elevate fluid volumes to accomplish it. And then last but not least, if it's around for a while, it does have a role in some of the cardiac changes that would occur in the sense of if you've got a reduced volume, reduced pressure, you're trying to, okay, maybe we'll get this heart working harder to push more, et cetera. So you have some more chronic changes that would occur or adapt to this situation of needing to increase BP and fluid. So that in a nutshell is renin, angio, aldosterone system. Make sure, again, you can do the hierarchy. Make sure you're good with the stimulus of each. But then again, kind of look at angio2 a little bit more specifically as far as the signaling that goes on there. So that's looking at it from the system standpoint. The only other thing I want to do is just kind of take a brief moment to look at the renin itself. After all, we are talking about the kidney per se, and just kind of really throw the same stuff against the wall, but just a different wall, that's all. So look at things that are going to stimulate renin. Again, its job is to do exactly what we talked about, pulling in more water and increase pressure. But the sympathetics are really the major, here we go, on switch. Those fibers that are landing down here, in this macula densa area, or juxtaglomerular area, is the signaling to say, yep, pro-neurotransmitter on switch. But the feedback from just the pressure of the blood vessel at that filtration, and also the feedback from the nephron saying there's reduced flow as well, also have a synergistic or the same, signaling mechanism. The key here, though, over on this side of the fence, the GFR and sodium flow and also just blood pressure, which would be the net result, are really the major inhibitory things for it. So if your systemic BP and volumes get back up to where they need to be, that's a feedback to inhibit the release of it. And then at the local level, if that kidney's reading that, you've got elevated GFR and flow going on, too as well. It's going to come back and talk to it that way. Angio2 and ADH both have the same, it's just a negative feedback loop, if you will. So that's an overview on the let's increase BP and fluid and retain fluid. The antagonist to all that is just these natriuretic peptides that are going to encourage getting rid of sodium and getting rid of fluid out of your body. So they're just doing the exact opposite. So a quick review, we've talked a little bit about ANP, BNP, and it's really just, localization where it's produced. But essentially their net effect is the same thing. A couple others more local out to the blood vessel or systemic system. And then there's another signaling mechanism just local to the kidney, if you will. But they're all going to do the same thing, encourage getting rid of sodium and dropping blood pressure and dropping fluid volumes. So AMP, BNP, as you might suspect, they're the antagonists, so they're going to inhibit that whole renin-angio system itself. And then directly as far as on blood vessels, so vasodilate, increase GFR as far as trying to get increased flow to that area for the filtration piece of it. They just want to push more sodium and water through this kidney or nephron. The C-type peptide we talked about, it's systemic, so its really action is nothing more than a local action within the blood vessels to dilate. So it's really more, it's not really so much acting on the kidney per se, but encouraging what the kidney's trying to do. And then last but not least, urodelatin. This is just one more kind of an antagonist, if you will, but not directly to aldosterone's effect and the ADH's effect in that distal tubule, the distal collecting duct, or the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. Both of those are the kind of final fine-tuning of how much water to pull in, pull out, how much sodium to pull in, pull out. So it makes sense. It acts there. And in this case, it's pushing sodium out the door and fluid out the door to, again, have a systemic drop in BP. So that's kind of an overview of, maintaining and balancing those. But again, keep in mind, kidney's got its local, but then obviously it's, big gross level as far as the body's physiology. All right, so that endeth Module 1, and we will sneak into Module 2. Having Friday morning senile moments, I did hit the record button. Took me, 20 minutes to go. Did I hit it? All right. Module 2. Okay. Module 2, if I remember right, a little more up-close discussion as far as filtration. So we'll talk a little bit about, or maybe expand on some of the things we've already chatted about as far as the nephron. But then the other piece of it is we're looking at this nephron as a start to finish and functionally what's going on through it. And as you know, it's a filter system. We've talked about, pushing stuff through. But we've also talked about its role. It pulls back everything, 99% of everything. So what we're going to do is follow what goes on with sodium. That's your major player in all of this. And also some of the other big players, things like a little discussion of glucose too as well. But the real connection with that clinically is just it's going on with your diuretics. As we said, hypertensive in America is, as common as the common cold, and pharmaceutical cocktail, whether you're in a primary care, cardio setting, wherever, it's always a little adjustment of, trying to find the right balance of those. So we'll try to connect some of the dots, or at least act as a reinforcement. You did your cardio, so you must have done your pharmaceutically, you must have done your diuretics, or no? Yeah, so maybe this might be retro, or just simply allow you to sleep and do a little multitasking too as well. We'll see. The choice is yours. All right. So looking at this thing as a filter, as we said, We want to talk a little bit more specific about what's going on in the PCT, the loop of Henle, and the DCT as far as this whole reabsorption process and a little bit of secretion and the characteristics of each. So what substances? Well, a pretty big laundry list of everything you'd expect. But what shouldn't go through this thing, and these are the two keys here as far as health of this filter. You shouldn't, obviously, in your urinalysis, you shouldn't be seeing red blood cells popping up through there, and you shouldn't see a lot of proteins popping through there. If so, obviously representing different forms or potential pathologies. As we go back to our discussion about the three-layered thing, what we're going to look at is just the size of the holes, if you will. In other words, the capillary itself, it's fenestrated. It's got all the little punch holes for things to get through. Then the next layer was that basement membrane. It has a negative charge, which is going to repel some of the things trying to get through. And then last but not least are these slits or openings created by the podocytes, which really, as we said, I think this is a much better visual. This is Bowman's capsule. And here's the outer layer of it, but this is the inner layer, if you will, and it's a specialized layer or filter for things to get into that nephron itself. So we'll look just briefly a little bit at each of those layers, if you will. In the endothelium versus the podocytes, in theory, the filtration, the slits, if you have a healthy glomerulus and nephron, those slits should be pretty approximated and maintaining a narrower space. So some things can get through 70 to 90 nanometers, and you go, whoa, what on earth is that? What I've done in a slide or two is just kind of compare, the size of a red blood cell to these things, and it'll put it in better perspective, I think. But out of the gates, again, the podocytes, the slice, a little bit thinner, smaller, and kind of the last filter, if you will, for that to occur. So let's sneak into the red blood cells. As we said, typical RBC, 8 micrometers. Again, I'm not, don't have all this math conversion in my head, so to speak. But I did give you a little relationship. 1 micrometer, 1,000 nanometers. So we're talking 25, 50, 70, 90 nanometers for these openings. And we're talking a red blood cell of 8 of these micrometers who are already, 100 times bigger. So huge size differential, plenty of room for buffer that these things shouldn't be getting through is the moral of the story there, unless pathology kicks in. I put this in as I thought it was just a beautiful picture of that internal wall. As I said, it's unique to the kidney. It's a lot more permeable than your skeletal muscle, capillaries where things are going back and forth. And again, that makes sense because you are trying to take stuff out of that bloodstream and dump it into this filter system along the way. So the basement, so that's the front edge, that's the capillary. The basement membrane, as we said, it has the issue of its negative charge, and it doesn't necessarily have slits, but you do have to get through the physical openingness of it, if you will. And that's where it really gets a little bit smaller in that sense. So when you get to your ClinMed discussion of different pathologies, these glomerular pathologies, subsets of them. There's different things, basement membrane disease type of things, and this is obviously what they're referring to, where the filter link is being affected, if you will. But anyways, the openings 4 to 8 nanometers, so now you're talking tiny here. And really what you want to do is red blood cells, no way. But the next question is, what about those darn proteins? What about albumin? That's what you're always kind of keeping in there to keep your fluid balance and your, ECF or interstitial fluid balance in check. And you don't want those floating through. So physically, as we said, 4 to 8. But that membrane is kind of the added thing. So even if I've got some that quote unquote is 7 nanometers, if it's a negative charge, I have that pushing it out too. So, it's not just a size thing. It's got electronegativity to repel it too as well. So as I said earlier there, albumin, major protein in your bloodstream, major protein, major balance as far as how much fluid is in your blood vessels and how much is in your interstitial, whether you have edema or not, et cetera, et cetera. So making sure this kidney isn't taking too much albumin out of your bloodstream is obviously a critical role. And this one's a lot closer in size. In other words, that red blood cell, a little bit bigger difference. But albumin's kind of right on the threshold. So that kidney has to be really healthy or it's going to start sneaking through and getting to where it doesn't belong, if you will. But it's not the physicalness, but it's more the negativityness of that membrane that's repelling or maintaining. So a healthy membrane, as we said, it's keeping the big guys out, but even some of the smaller size, the negative charge is doing the repelling, but allowing small molecules and, sodium and chloride and glucose and et cetera, all that kind of stuff to be able to get dumped into the filter as needed. So in a healthy urinalysis, and just doing a bedside strip, you've got the comparison of each, but, you start looking down here, and it's your proteins, that's what we're talking about, and your red blood cells, that's what we're talking about is this filter. Urobilinogen and bilirubin, et cetera, we talked a little bit more about liver function, et cetera, earlier on in the term. Okay, so pathology. Two classic scenarios, too much protein or any red blood cells or blood cells found in there. And so again, it should make sense whether you've got some kind of basement membrane disease or failure, or also the proximal tubule as far as some of the reabsorption and things that go on and secretion that go on there. That PCT can be damaged, whether through its toxicity, pharmaceutically or pathology can occur. Blood have kind of got often associated with inflammatory. If you think about it too, inflammation, what's it do? Make vessels a lot more permeable. And so the blood vessel of that glomerulus is no different. So there's our happy entertainment as far as the visual. I thought this was a nice slide. As I said, what I'm really trying to do is set the stage for your discussion as far as these glomerular pathologies, because they really are. There's multiple subsets, and I don't know how fast and furious they'll go through them. But if you're kind of on speed with the different pieces of it, it should help the cause. But again, if you look at this, was just in the case of a diabetic as far as potential kidney compensation, adaptation that may have occurred. But, anything involving that changes in that basement membranes, in this case, a thickening, so you're creating some either increase or decrease. Some of these conditions block filtration. Some of them obviously crank out too much filtration. And then the podocytes, again, they're no different. They're a cell. Things can cause apoptosis. Things can cause dysfunction of those cells, peel them away, not allow them to physically line up, et cetera. And you have your filtration damage that way. Haven't talked too much about it, but the mesangial cells themselves can be in a state of, a chronic situation where they're increasing in size and altering just the surface area and altering your GFR that way. So that's kind of an overview. I thought this was a nice slide just to reinforce what I was talking about, the last on the 3 tiers of these podocytes. This was beautifully, well, it was probably photoshopped in, but, they're highlighting a single cell. Here's that capillary coming through in this awkward, convoluted shape of a podocyte, covering there. But it has to fit the puzzle, nice and tightly to maintain that slit there, as far as its opening. So over here, anything that's going to disrupt that, so whether the thing could peel off, whether the apoptosis and the cell could die off, or just simply atrophy is going to change the openings of those. So again, it just gives you a good visual for those potential pathologies you'll be talking about. All right, two more terms. We're talking a little bit about blood sneaking through, protein sneaking through. Nephrotic, nephritic, was this included maybe or maybe not in your discussions with your diuretics, cardio? I don't think so. I'm sure it's more reserved for when you get to the renal clin med next term. Nephrotic and nephritic syndrome obviously relate to the kidney, the renal, but they're not disease entities in themselves. What they're really describing is kind of a lab pattern that may go on with a lot of different diseases, if you will. And so often you'll see, one subset of a glomerulopathy, if you will, and it's going to have different changes as far as red blood cells, proteins, edema, lipids, etc. And then you'll have another one and another one. But within those, some tend to follow a certain pattern, and they may refer to it as a nephrotic syndrome, or they may refer to it as a nephritic syndrome, if you will. So before I define each of those, just wanted to kind of briefly, talk about the potentials for anything screwing up that filtration. The proteins we've already, chatted about for potential. But the flip side of that is if you are also, blood values, if you're excreting albumin out the kidneys at, a massive rate, obviously your blood values are going to go down, which is going to kind of have that secondary or cascade effect of, diffuse edema, as far as your interstitial fluid, as far as in response to the amount of protein in the bloodstream. So kind of all these go hand in hand. Dyslipidemia as far as fat values often associated. But the other issue, red blood cells we've talked about, but oliguria, anything that's reducing just filtration or urine function in the first place, and azotemia, too as well. Urea and other nitrogen compounds, if you will, have to make their way through appropriately through the kidney. Your bun, which you'll talk about as far as your kidney function levels, if it's elevated or depressed, will, give you an indication of what's going on with the filtration. But getting back to nephritic, nephrotic, the only thing I really wanted to highlight, and this is a very Reader's Digest, but this is kind of getting to the nuts and bolts of it, if you will. Nephritic is really referring to, the common theme is you'll see different conditions that are associated, those, say nephritic syndrome, but the other variables that we talked about may alter a little bit. But the one constant theme is there's hematuria, a lot of red blood cells getting through into that nephron, into the urine, and that's referred to as nephritic syndrome. Nephrotic, the opposite as far as the proteins. So again, I think that'll just give you a little platform when you hit the ground running for your clin med discussions, renal. You know me and the simplicity of my synaptic gaps here, so nephrotic's got the O, proteins, and there you go, connect the dots, and you got one of them down pat. All right, a few other things, talking about filtration. Renal blood flow, we've already chatted about it, and how to maintain it, monitor it, blah, blah, blah. So that piece should be pretty straightforward. Permeability, again, we already talked about those fenestrated pores and anything that's going to alter them. And again, classically, inflammatory responses, no different than any other capillaries, are going to increase permeability, so it makes sense that you see some of those things. But the bottom line is, as I said, this just reiterates what I said earlier. These glomerular capillaries in the first place are far more permeable than your other typical capillary beds throughout your body. But I want to talk a little bit about the surface area and the mesangial cells, not a whole lot. You don't have to, again, I'm not going to go, okay, what's the, is it 0.9, 0.8 squared meters, but just to appreciate, just like with the lungs and the alveolar as far as surface area, pretty significant capillary surface area. You know, we talked about the blood volumes going through that thing, the filtration, you know, and the turnover, and 180 in a day, and so on and so forth. So you definitely need a lot of surface area, you know, at the same moment to filter in any given time. But as we said earlier, these mesangial cells can either contract that surface area or expand that surface area. So as we said earlier too, something that start chronically makes those mesangial cells adapt can give a more permanent alteration to surface area, you know, not in such a good way. But what I'd like to do is just kind of relate the dot of the mesangial cells, surface area, and then simply who talks to those mesangial cells, or what are some of the influences. And if you think about it, contraction of the mesangial cells, reduced GFR, everything on this laundry list here simply represents what we chatted about at the end of Module 1. Their job, reduce GFR and retain as much fluid in the body. So, you know, it should just make kind of common sense when you look at the big picture of it. Come downstairs here, and I could also put BMP down here, but those natriuretic peptides have the opposite effect, and that makes sense too. They're very pro push more GFR, you know, through this filter and push more water out of the body. So that's kind of the kind of synergistic or agonist-antagonist role of these two that affect on the mesangial cells. All right. We'll muscle through this one. It's not too bad. I always look to the clock and look for mercy for you. All right. Last but not least, with filtration, we'll get into a little physics, not too much physics, but just briefly, we have to entertain ourselves with it. And what we need to think about is you have a filtration. You've got the blood vessel system, and you got a nephron. A nephron has fluid in it, you know, and it has physicalness too, and just as well as the blood vessel system or the capillary system. And so the first thing that's going to determine, you know, how much fluid is pushing through, we talked about the pressure of that blood vessel or your systemic, you know, your cardiovascular system pushing through. That makes sense. We've already chatted about that, but what we haven't chatted about is somebody's pushing back, and that nephron's got fluid in it, and it's got a hydrostatic pressure pushing back too as well. So ultimately, the sum total of this filtration is the balance between hydrostatic pressure pushing this way and hydrostatic pressure pushing that way. Then come down one more level, and you have to deal with concentration gradients and osmotic pressures pushing and pulling back and forth too. So we'll take on each one of these and just walk away from the concept of, you know, it's not just a one-way filtration pressure gradient, if you will. It's a net sum. But the first one on the list, glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure, we've already chatted about that. And essentially, this number should make sense. We've talked about the values getting into those kidneys. We've talked about, 45s and, 50, and often you hear this number in that 50-ish kind of range. Below that is where, kidney function begins to cease, or you need to maintain 50s to keep visceral organs alive. So that should make sense. And so obviously anything drastically elevating and getting beyond the autonomic control or the autoregulation is going to alter things. But the flip side, anything that's gone through the basement floor and dropped it too low is obviously going to decrease filtration and encourage kidney shutdown. But the next piece of it, we haven't talked about too much, but you think about it function-wise. We said that Bowman's capsule has fluid in there, it's pushing back. And it's not pushing back that much. You want to keep the gradient going in the right direction. So it's got about, say, 15 millimeters of mercury pushing back. So between the two, the physicalness of these guys, you're still doing pretty A-okay. You've got, 40 millimeters of mercury pushing in the right direction to keep filtration going. But I just kind of started this little point. Again, you can start to see the physicalness of something as, innocent as an obstructive, kidney stone or anything that's creating a congestive backup of that kidney, how you're going to start to potentially affect filtration if allowed to persist or if it's serious enough. But now we want to talk a little bit about concentration gradients, if you will. So again, depending on which side is more concentrated, the more concentrated side is going to want to be pulling more fluid towards it. So you have a pressure going one way or the other way in terms of that. So in the glomerular capillary situation, in a healthy scenario, you got a lot of concentration. You've got, albumin, so you've got a heavy-duty concentration. So what that means is the water, the H2O, still wants to pull back into that capillary, if you will. So physically, you're pounding the thing with 55 millimeters of mercury. It's physically pushing back with another 15 and, to push it back into the bloodstream, if you will. But also because of the concentration gradient in the pull fluid-wise, it's pushing fluid back at about 30 millimeters of mercury. But the good news is you do the math and, you still wind up with a pro-filtration number. In other words, 15 and 30 is 45, pushing back, you're pushing in with 55, so you should, have a favorable filtration. So that's what I mean by it's not just a simple one-way gradient as far as things. As far as Bowman's capsule, not really an issue unless there's too much stuff in there, too much albumin. If you think about it, if you've got proteins or red blood cells getting in there, all of a sudden you got a concentration, but that's probably the least of their, on the totem pole of problems going on. So often you'll see this is just a nice schematic adding up the numbers for you, just giving you the visual of pushing 55 this way. That osmotic pressure we were talking about is trying to pull fluid back at 30, and meanwhile the physicalness of that Bowman's capsule pushing back, and the net sum of all those forces gives you still a filtration of 10 millimeters of mercury. So again, in a nutshell, that's kind of the balancing act in that little glomerulus of what's going on to keep a healthy filtration, if you will. This was just a Netter's version of some of the physiology. Won't get into it too much, but also if you think about it, the concentration things are going to vary as it makes its way through the capillary itself, the start of it to the finish. And so that osmotic pressure we were talking about does vary from the beginning to the end, but for our purposes, just kind of put it in a static standpoint, but the reality is there's some little sub dynamics that go on too with that osmotic change. Okay, why don't we pause 2 seconds for station identification, and we will be back at 9 o'clock and get into the nephron itself.